I hit record, Caroline.
Did you start record, Lee?
Yes.
Okay. How many participants are we at?
They're ticking up. We're at 33.
Welcome everyone. We're just going to give people a little bit of time to join. This is the Fire on the Maine Landscape webinar. We'll get started in a minute or two. Just want to give people a chance to settle into their living rooms in front of their computers. But welcome. Thank you for joining us. Lee, will people automatically come in who are signing on for, oh, I can't hear you, you're muted.
There's no need to let people in from a waiting room if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, nope, they're just in.
Okay. Okay, I think in the interest of, they always say that you're supposed to reward people for showing up on time. So I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone on this almost the shortest and darkest day of the year. We're hoping to bring a little light into your into the darkness with this exploration of fire tonight. We're delighted to co-host tonight's presentation with our longtime partners, Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust. This presentation is made possible by the support of our members, and if you're not a member, we hope you'll consider joining us. Just to do a little housekeeping, because we have 3 presenters, we're using the webinar format to keep things simple tonight. So you'll only see our presenters, and each of our speakers will talk for about 15 minutes and we'll handle all the questions at the end. So if you have questions along the way, put them into the Q&A box at the bottom. You might have to move your cursor down to the bottom to make it appear, but put all your questions in there, and Lee Cataldo from BTLT and I will basically go through those at the end and put them to our presenters. We are going to record this. You started the recording, right, Lee? I did. Okay, thanks. We are going to record this and make it available on our websites in the next day or two. So if you know someone, excuse me, who is interested in seeing this, they'll be able to access it there. The idea for this presentation grew out of a desire to better understand the role of fire in our landscape. We've all seen the fires out west. Maine has had some very destructive wildfires in the past. Some of you may have watched the short video about the Great Fire of 1947 that I included with a meeting link that I sent out last weekend. And Lee, do you have the link to that?
I can put that in the chat.
I think Lee is going to put a link to that short video in the chat box. But what we're learning is, or what we're relearning, I guess, is that fire can be used really effectively as a management tool for a variety of purposes, and we'll learn about that tonight. So we're lucky to have, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce our presenters. We are lucky to have 3 wonderful presenters, and I'll introduce them before each of them speaks. That are going to help us explore the history and use of fire in Maine. We're starting out with James Eric Francis Sr., the Penobscot Nation's Director of Cultural and Historic Preservation. He's also a tribal historian and chair of the Penobscot Tribal Rights and Resource Protection Board. As a historian, James studies the relationship between Maine Native Americans and the landscape. Prior to working at the Penobscot Nation, James worked for the Wabanaki Studies Commission, helping to implement the new Maine Native American Studies law into Maine schools. James has co-produced a film called Invisible, which examines racism experienced by Native Americans in Maine and Canadian America. He is co-chair of the Abbey Museum's Board of Trustees and co-director of Local Context, an initiative to support Native, First Nations, Aboriginal, and Indigenous communities in the management of their intellectual property and cultural heritage. James also serves on the University of Maine's Hudson Museum Advisory Board. He is a historical researcher, photographer, filmmaker, painter, and graphic artist. So take it away, James.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? So I just want to start off by kind of exploring fire in general. Just what is fire and what does fire mean to humankind? You know, I think fire is probably the most influential feature in the peopling of the world. It's those regimes, those places that could be fired, that people went to. And because of that, fire often followed us. You know, fire has evolved as human history has evolved. It has gone through many steps. It fueled the Industrial Revolution. It helped us with agriculture. And this takes place in every corner of this planet. It's even followed us to the moon. In fact, it was the main driver, that main element that actually made travel to the moon possible. So as the days get longer, I've been thinking about fire quite a bit, and I study the landscape. I study indigenous people's connection to their indigenous landscapes and really look at how that influences us and how we can extract historic knowledge from that. And looking at Maine in particular and the history of fire here, first we have to understand how much fire is caused by, say, lightning strikes. This is a main form of ignition of fire, and only 15% of all fires in Maine historically have been caused by lightning strikes, at least 85%. Much of that, probably all of that, is what's called anthropogenic fire, fire started by people. When we look at the historic record, and this is from contact forward, so the historic era is a written era. We see that explorers who came to southern New England, they found that the Native Americans there were burning the forest twice a year. They would burn the undergrowth of these hardwood forests so often that the canopies would not catch on fire, that the fuel load on the forest floor would just burn. And they did this for a couple of reasons. They did it for ease of travel through the forest, ease of hunting, and not just being able to see what you're hunting, but the new growth after the fire attracted deer to those areas and made hunting easier because the deer came to you. So when you think about that in southern New England and try to translate that into what's going on here in northern New England and the state of Maine, there's a vast difference of forest makeup. As you get up into the upper reaches of the state, we become what's called the boreal forest, and burning the undergrowth is really difficult without catching the canopy on fire. So those tactics of burning twice a year did not take place here from an indigenous standpoint. What did take place are more specific burns. You know, we would burn a site for a village, say, or if a village site was overrun with vermin, we would burn that. And also we would burn to help with agriculture. One interesting thing about the language as it ties to agriculture is that our word in Penobscot for field, like a field, is bemskudek. And bemskudek, skud, the word skud is fire. So embedded within the word for field is fire. And so that says a lot. You know, I had an elder once tell me that to understand the culture, you must understand the language, and also to understand the language, you must understand the culture. So there's a cyclical nature there. But what this word is telling me that is that to create a field in our homeland, fire was intimately involved. There were some studies done in a place called Pineo Ridge, which is north of Harrington, Cherryfield, the blueberry capitals of the world. In the Pineo Ridge is a blueberry barren place where they grow and harvest blueberries. And in core samples in ponds and lakes nearby, they found pollen that was consistent with plants that thrived in post-fire conditions. And they also found charcoal. And these core samples brought the use of fire back thousands of years in that area, really shaping what Pineo Ridge has become today. Essentially, Pineo Ridge is a glacial outwash delta, and it has pine trees which thrive in post-fire conditions, and it has blueberries and little else. And as many know today, they burn blueberry fields to help rid competition from the area and nourish the soil with those ashes. But fire had shaped that landscape, and humans had used that fire to shape that landscape. And so there's a very long history of indigenous people in Maine using fire to, well, as a forest management tool. But that isn't just here, and that's not just with indigenous people. This is global, worldwide, and the history of mankind. Fire is so important to mankind in general. I find it interesting that we're struggling with fires due to global warming, but it was fire that created that global warming with the burning of fossil fuels. And so, there are there's an interesting kind of irony there. And I often hear that people demonize fire. And yes, fire is destructive, but I don't see it as this evil entity, this destructive force, because it brings renewal. It's natural. It it's part of our human existence here on this planet. I'm not sure if my 15 minutes is up, but I'm up.
Thank you, James. That was wonderful. I love your reflections on the many, I guess, the many faces of fire in our world. I just want to note that James has a wonderful article called Burnt Harvest. And Lee, if you have the link to that, Lee will put it in the chat box, and we can send around a link to that. That summarizes his research on the use of fire by the Penobscots in Maine. So, so put any questions you have for James in the Q&A box, and we're going to move on to Aliesha. So Aliesha, you can show yourself and unmute yourself. And just to tell you a little bit about Aliesha, Aliesha Black has been a forest ranger with the Maine Forest Service since 2007. She spent most of her time in the Damerscott district. She serves as the member at large for the newly formed Maine Prescribed Burn Council. When I was first trying to reach Aliesha for this presentation, she was in Colorado. Were you fighting fires or doing prescribed? Yeah,
you're fighting fire, yeah.
Yeah. So she's got plenty of experience with both wildfires and prescribed fire. And she is now working with BTLT, planning the BTLT's second prescribed burn on one of its properties. And hopefully, what are the plans? Are the plans for the spring of 2021?
Hoping so, yes.
Okay, great. So take it away, Aliesha.
Okay, so I think just to start, maybe some folks aren't familiar with what a forest ranger does, but we enforce all outdoor burning laws and timber harvesting laws in the state. And part of my job as a forest ranger is I do go out west or all over the country. Actually, I've been down south, out west, up north, and into Canada to fight fire. And in that, I found all different techniques and management tools that I was seeing on the fire line on how to fight fire. And that got me really interested in prescribed burning. Currently, I'm a nationally qualified firing boss and a low complexity burn boss, which I think will give you a little bit of background to the presentation. So I thought it would be smart to start with talking about the fire causes of 2020. It gives people a perspective of what's causing the fires right here in this state. So as of December, I think I pulled this, December 17th, I put all these human caused fires in the yellow, were campfire, smoking, debris.
Aliesha, can you share your screen?
Oh,
I'm not seeing it yet.
oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. About here.
There we go. Perfect.
And is that, hold on one second, let me make sure I got it right here.
Perfect. That's your opening screen. Great.
Okay, let's go again. All right, so the fire causes for human, now you can see the pie chart. Human causes were campfire, smoking, debris, arson, child-caused fireworks, and miscellaneous, which miscellaneous tends to, a majority of it is dumped stove ashes or any kind of wood ashes. Machine in the green, which we can all understand are elements of a human fire, include equipment, railroad, power line, and structure. Anything that comes from a structure into the woods. The orange piece is the only natural fire cause, and that's lightning. The red piece is the undetermined at this point, just so you can see that. I thought it would be interesting, was said in the beginning, folks have questions about the California fires or just the Western fires. And a lot of the footage that we see from a Western fire shows the most damaging and dramatic footage of crowning fires. And if you have the question of, can that happen in the state of Maine? And the answer is yes. I pulled the data from 1990 till now. And this just shows the fires that have happened in this state that were crowning fires. And what a crowning fire is when the treetops align and that's your fuel source. So I think James was speaking about these low intensity fires that cover the ground. These are fires that happen in the trees, and that's the driving factor of that fire. And to get a crown fire, there needs to be an alignment of fuels, topography, and wind. And Maine doesn't have those conditions often, but when we do have those conditions, we've done a really great job of informing our public. And I think as a people, if there's a red flag or a high wind warning that's been issued, people in the state of Maine tend to pay attention to that. We don't have the complacency that maybe other parts of the country have, where they're so used to it. I think it really affects people, and we tend to have people more careful with fire. If you were able to watch that 1947 fire video, it was, I think some of the things that have changed since then. We have the Maine Forest Service itself has a lot of air support that can quickly react in the state. Our fire departments have mutual aid agreements for quick and robust responses. Our communication is organized and practiced, and our radio communications as well. We have a lot of statewide operating systems that are really beneficial when there's an emergency happening. We have uniform training too, which is a big deal, from structural firefighters that learn about wildland in their normal classes to those that are dedicated to wildland and having something across the board that everybody can use as common terminology. And another thing in the state of Maine is our forestry practices have changed. We don't have as many slash piles as we did 20, 30 years ago. We've had a chipping industry that's kind of helped out with that. So why use a prescribed burn? Historically, Maine landowners, farmers burned for blueberry habitat and some other reasons that we heard earlier. Field and crop rotation throughout the state. And I was speaking with some other retired or current forest rangers, and trying to get a sense of when they saw prescribed burning stop in the state. And the 1980s, they saw quite a bit of decline in prescribed burning. The last decade, though, we've seen a resurgence in prescribed burning for different reasons. It's being looked at more closely as a land management tool. And I think, Nancy's going to cover a lot of this, but wildlife habitat, vista improvement, invasive species, ticks, reducing insect populations. At the end, I've included a link, but there's a lot of research going on, and there's even some at the University of Maine, and some of it's a little bit conflicting, but there are some long-term prescribed burning studies that have shown a reduction in tick abundance and tick-borne disease transmission. Invasive species showing if you intermix the cutting and burn periods that you can cut the growth of some of these species. Another reason to have a prescribed burn is for fuel reduction. That's the extra fuel that builds up in ecosystems, particularly where you have wildfires that have been in the past. But this picture here of the railroad, that's a place that was burning a lot. They would have incidental burns from railroad breaks that would set off embers into the dry area there and cause fires that weren't controlled and could get out of control quickly. So getting rid of that ahead of time is a preventative measure. And the other reason we, especially with the Maine Forest Service, use prescribed burning is for training. We do all the wildland fire training in this state. We teach a course, and it's called S13190, and it's a wildland firefighting course. It teaches wildfire behavior with weather and suppression techniques. We have a fire academy for new firefighters. We teach a refresher training every year for fire departments and volunteers, and for those that are interested in working out of state. The the biggest help with prescribed fire is it's such a great training tool because you can observe fire behavior in its natural state and seeing how different fuels react and are affected by fire. And then how your suppression techniques are going to work. If you look at this picture, these folks are learning how to make a fire break, a fire line here. And they're cutting away those fuels down to mineral soil. And you'll see a diagram of that. But just taking a look at how that's done, and these folks are in a line and they're using tools and they bump around as time goes and they create that line to stop the fire from passing through. Currently, the Maine Forest Service is working with land that's held in public interest. We work with the Bureau of Parks and Lands. We've recently, in the past 5 years, have worked, if you guys have been to Mount Blue, across from the park manager's residence, we did the blueberry burning there. And there's a piece at Center Hill that we burned. If you've been to Rome and some of those pieces of parks land, there's a blueberry piece that we've burned. We worked with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and some other folks to burn Swan Island for bird habitat. And I'll show later on here some pictures from Calderwood Island, where we did some burning to reintroduce grazing species on that island. Maine Forest Service cannot conduct prescribed burns on private property. Private citizens looking to have a controlled burn on their land would still need a burn permit, and all permits are issued by town wardens and fire departments. So if, in case there were some questions or if they needed any assistance with talking about techniques or forces needed for those kinds of burns, that they would consult the Maine Forest Service. In an unorganized town, the Maine Forest Service reviews all those plans and writes the burn permits for a controlled burn. We've worked with Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Coastal Mountains Land Trust, University of Maine, the town of Brunswick, and as you've heard, the Topsham Land Trust. This is a piece from the burn that was conducted in conjunction with the Brunswick Fire Department. There were also volunteers from the Maine Forest Service that assisted in the preparation work and controlling the fire. This section was completed, but right as we finished the burn, the weather changed and the relative humidity dropped to a lower amount that was prescribed for the burn. And so it's like, the question comes, what does that mean? So when writing a burn plan, there are a lot of elements that go into it. And that doesn't make for an exciting picture because a lot of it is you sitting at a desk trying to go through all the documentation and the budding landowners and writing it all down so that there's something written to so that you're able to follow it. In a burn plan, there are purpose and goals of the burn, listing all the abutting property owners, what smoke is going to impact or where it's going to impact and how we can mitigate that, the public outreach and notifications that need to happen, equipment and personnel needs for that fire, weather parameters for what makes best burning conditions, how you can attain those goals for the burn, and what's safest. There are maps showing the area, and there's radio operations to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So this diagram here shows the anatomy of a prescribed burn. And if you look up at the top, I'm going to put my pointer on here. I think I got it. Okay. So this here, the wind direction. The wind direction determines the firing operation, how the fire is put on the ground. Each prescribed fire needs a safe way to start the ignitions, and this requires a fire break. If you look here, this number one, they've used, let's say it's a stream, a wider stream or river here. They use that fire break to stop the fire from passing through. So they start against the wind. So the wind again is blowing in this direction, and they start the fire right up against that fire break. The fire is lit, so the wind's going to push it right into the fire break. They use different patterns and methods to attain the desired effect. So you can actually slow the fire down or get it quicker depending on what firing techniques you're using. Once there's sufficient black line, you can see here number 2, this is all black. So what that means is the fuels have been consumed, and so it's black and that it should not reburn. And once there's a sufficient black line, the dead and consumed fire fuels cannot reignite. the fire can be brought out ahead. Here, you can see the start of the first head fire, head fire, head fire. And these fires here, they may grow together, but they're going with the wind at this point into this black piece to stop the fire from happening. So if all of this is done correctly and everything's being paid attention to, hopefully you can contain the fire with your resources, which this picture shows pretty well. So this here, if you look right through this line here, is a hand line that we showed those folks that were building a hand line in that previous picture of training. The holding crew, which would be these people here, are they created a hand line where there is no natural breaks. So we can see that they use this river as the natural fire break, and then they've created a hand line here to stop, and it goes all the way around the fire break, the perimeter fire break, over to this road that's already been established. The hand line doesn't have any fuels. They're cut and dug down to the soil, so no fire can cross. They use the engine over here to stop any spot fires, or that they're a mobile attack, so they can move. And a lot of these wildland fire engines can go on grass in this area to go and catch something that may get out ahead or spot across a line or anything like that. The ignitions crew, so here's an igniter here, and here's an igniter here. These are the folks that are putting the fire on the ground. So again, just like in that previous slide, they've put fire right across by this river, and it's slowly creeping its way this way. They're putting what's called a flanking fire up this side. And then this other igniter here is lighting these head fires, so that can all meet up and hopefully just stay contained in this nice little box here. What you can also see in this picture are these folks across the way. So they're either spotters, some of the holding team, making sure that nothing is coming across this line and spotting into this back field, or they might be weather observers, keeping weather observations that can change at any moment, the relative humidity, the wind speed and direction, things that can really affect a fire. Watching for fire to jump through the fire break. And they can be really great eyes. So sometimes the smoke will just all of a sudden sock in, and these folks are out away from the fire, so they have good eyes to see what's happening. So I'm just going through some of the safety precautions that we go through to make sure that everything is accounted for. So I can see I'm almost at my 2 minutes. So the Calderwood Island fire that we had, this is a good picture of a briefing. This is a test fire. And then these are the fuels as the test fires started. And this is juniper out on Calderwood Island outside between North Haven and Vinyl Haven. And that juniper, the relative humidity was actually quite high, which means the moisture in the air was pretty high. And that juniper lit up like crazy. So the progression, I just wanted to show as we brought the fire up this road, you can see it. And then we tied it in across on this piece to this trail here. So then the other side of that was this fire. And then immediately after, this is the result, just the skeletons of that juniper. And then this is an aerial shot of as we were leaving, because we did fly in all of our supplies. And then I actually went there this year, and here's the grass reestablished, and there are sheep on the island as well, which is pretty cool. And so I've just included some tools and resources. The Maine Prescribed Fire Council is a venue for collaboratively promoting the responsible use of prescribed fire as a land and natural resource management tool for conservation and restoration in Maine. So if you have any questions, this will give you the place to ask them or find some answers, or the people to ask them directly to. This is a cool fact sheet about blueberry burning and other methods for blueberries. This is the entomology. A lot of folks have questions about insects and how that affects fire. So I included the entomology website. And this is a link for some documents that have been published on tick studies in the US. So I am done.
Great, thank you, Aliesha. Aliesha did an incredibly good job of describing what a prescribed burn looks like, because I observed it when BTLT did its burn I think it was in 2010, and it was absolutely fascinating to watch, and really shows you that you can have a lot of confidence. And I assume that the methods haven't changed that much from back when, you know, the Penobscots were doing it, you know, pre-contact. So Nancy, you can share your screen, and while you're doing that, let's see. Nancy Sferra is the Director of Land Management for the Nature Conservancy in Maine. She has a master's degree in wildlife biology and has been using prescribed fire as a management tool for 33 years. And Nancy has an incredible, really impressive amount of experience with prescribed fire. And so she's gonna talk about use of prescribed fire for ecological purposes. And Nancy, I don't know if you want to, I can see your first slide. I don't know if you want to turn on your video so people can see you. And Nancy, we can't hear you yet. I think you need to unmute.
So my video should be on.
Okay, got it.
Yep. Okay.
Anyway.
Screen showing okay?
Yep.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining and giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that the Nature Conservancy has been doing with regards to ecological fire management. I'm going to talk about two primary natural community types, pitch pine scrub oak barrens and sandplain grasslands, where we've been actively doing burning down in York County for our first burn down there was in 1990. So I'm going to first talk about our pitch pine scrub oak barren sites. Both of these natural communities I'm going to talk about are located on very deep deposits, glacial deposits of sand and gravel. So these sites have about 90 feet of sand and gravel underneath of them. They're acidic, they're really dry and droughty, they have really poor soil and nutrients. And so fire is sort of a rejuvenating disturbance in these sites. Most of these sites in sort of a natural fire cycle would burn between every 15 to 60 years or so. And walking through the vegetation at a place like Waterboro Barrens, starting up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, the dominant shrub in these sites is scrub oak, which is an oak that only gets about 15 feet tall, but grows in a very dense growth form. It's just a tangle of multiple stems, loves to be burned. And if you go down below that, that's a picture of one of our rare plants. It's fernleaf false foxglove, which is a very alliterative name for a plant. It's one of the state rare plants. It likes to be burned, it likes to be disturbed. So after forest management, it'll come back. Anything that sort of disturbs the soil, this plant is happy. If you go to the left of that, the other dominant shrub that gets up into the sub canopy is gray birch. Again, it doesn't get up to a very large tree size, but is pretty dominant in the understory of these sites. The other understory tree shrub that we have that's pretty dominant is low bush blueberry too, which I didn't picture here. And then the dominant tree species on these sites is pitch pine. And pitch pine has these really great adaptations for being able to survive fire. First of all, it's got really thick bark, and that thick bark protects it from the heat of the fire. It also is one of the few pines that will resprout from the base. So you can cut it down, you can top kill it with fire, and it'll resprout. If you look at the photo underneath the title Waterboro Barrens, you'll see that pitch pine is all fuzzy. Pitch pines also have something called an epicormic bud, and there's little buds underneath the bark of the tree. And if the tree gets injured, the bark will sprout these epicormic branches. So if it's injured by fire or insects, you'll get these trees that will resprout these epicormic buds. So pitch pine can lose about 70% of its needles in a fire and still survive. The other thing it has, not so much in Maine, but farther south, where burning like New Jersey pine barrens is more common, they have serotinous cones. In Maine, only about 10% of our cones are serotinous, but what they are cones that are sort of welded shut by a wax layer. And when the cones are subjected to fire, they'll open up, they'll drop the seeds, and the seeds will land on freshly burned soil. So they come in contact with mineral soil, which is what they need for regenerating, for germinating. So this tree has some really cool adaptations to burning. Does really, really well under fire. And of course, we're not burning strictly for vegetation. We want to burn to help the species that live in the pitch pine scrub oak. And so the two birds at the top, on the left is a whippoorwill, on the right is a common nighthawk. Both of those species like to nest on bare ground. And so that's bare ground is one of the things that we're trying to strive for in about 10% of our burn sites, is to get some of the mineral soil exposed so that there's good nesting habitat for these two birds. In the bottom right-hand corner is the eastern towhee. It loves these shrubby habitats. It's very common out at water road barrens. And then there's a whole suite of butterflies and moths that benefit from the burning there. So in the center, and all these there's like 12 species of butterflies and moths that are rare at this site. And they all feed on, the caterpillars all feed on either scrub oak or pitch pine or low bush blueberry. So in the center is Edward's hairstreak. That species feeds on oak. In the bottom center is the pine sphinx. That species feeds on pitch pine needles. And then on the left side is the Barron's buck moth that feeds on oak, scrub oak. So we're trying to burn every somewhere between every 10 to 60 years at this site. This site's in really good shape. So we really are in a maintenance stage, but our objective is to make sure that we reduce the fuel loads so that we can burn safely and provide habitat for the species that are found there. So moving down to Kennebunk and Wells, the towns of Kennebunk and Wells, there's two sites that are side by side across the branch brook from one another that are sandplain grassland sites. And this is a site where we know it has a very long history of fire. Indigenous peoples burned this site. We also know that it was managed as a commercial blueberry barrens in the early part of the 19th century up until about 1987. And in 1987, they actually started using Velpar as the management tool out there instead of using fire to maintain the site. Luckily, the state purchased much of Kennebunk Plains. Nature Conservancy owns a little bit in the late 1980s. And then Nature Conservancy purchased Wells Barrens in 2010. So it's a very large sandplain grassland that's under conservation. And again, this is a very deep sand and gravel deposit, and it's an anthropogenic natural community. If we were to not do any management whatsoever at this site, it would revert back to a pitch pine scrub oak barrens. That's what it wants to be. And so we've been actively managing this on about a 4-year rotation, 4 to 5 year rotation, primarily with fire, but we have to do occasional mowing because fire alone won't eliminate all the shrubs out on this site. So taking a look at some of the species that we're managing for, up in the right-hand corner is the black racer snake. The black racers are at the northern limit of their range at Kennebunk Plains. This is one of the best sites in the state for that snake. And it's important to maintain snakes on this site because as the climate warms, those are the species that are going to be able to migrate northward with the warming climate. So it's really important to maintain a viable population here. The 3 bird species that are on the slide on the left-hand side is a Vesper sparrow. All 3 of these species nest on the ground in grassland sites. Vesper sparrows typically like something a little bit older, so 3 to 4 years post-fire. Grasshopper sparrows, which is a little bit more rare than the Vesper sparrow, typically will come in about 2 years after a burn. And then upland sandpipers, which is probably the most threatened of all these species, is likes to come in almost right after a burn and will stick around for 4 or 5 years in that kind of habitat. And then if you look at the flower in the bottom of the screen, it's really great. This site has the world's largest population of northern blazing star, which is that flower. We like to say we can monitor at 55 miles an hour. There are millions of stems. The next closest population probably has less than 1,000 stems. It's restricted to New England. There's also an interesting thing. Right after the year after you burn a site, the plant will just profusely flower. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner, the foreground hasn't been burned recently, but the background where you see all of the purple flowers was burned the year before. And so they put out this profuse amount of flowers as a response to the fire. The other interesting thing is that there's a Microlepidoptera. There's 2 species actually that lay their eggs in the flowers of blazing star, and they'll prey on the seeds of the blazing star, so they completely destroy the seeds. So if a site hasn't been burned for a while, 90% of the seeds are eaten by these caterpillars, and so 90% of the seeds aren't viable. Year after the burn, it's down to about 30% of the seeds are no longer viable. So we knock back the population of the moth through the burning, and also sort of overwhelm the moth with so many flowers it can't eat all the seeds that are out there. So we're helping to make sure there's more viable seeds that are repopulating this area through the use of fire. So we're burning on about a 4 or 5 year rotation. We burn about 25% of the site per year. Nature Conservancy also has, we have our own burn boss. We train our own staff to do fire. We have equipment, but we work with partners a lot. Maine Forest Service, Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a suite of volunteers to help us do the prescribed burning. They're all trained through the same training that wildfire crews go through. And we write burn plans for all of our sites, similar to what Alicia was talking about. So one of the things we have to do before we burn a site is we have to do some vegetation management. When we first got Wells Barren, it hadn't been burned in about 30 years. And we had to go in and do some cutting there in order to get the area suitable for us to safely do a prescribed fire out there. And it also helped us reset the vegetation back to a more grassland state. Now we can burn on a rotation and maintain that grassland through this vegetation management. Similarly, at Waterboro, this is a picture of one corner of Waterboro Barrens, and you can see all the houses in and around our preserve. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is taken in 2012, and you can see that there's nothing that separates our preserve from all these houses. This is a photo that was taken in 2013, and you can see this is our boundary line right here. And here's a internal fire break on a sand road. Boundary lines here. We went and cut about 100 feet along all of those boundary lines to create more of an open area so that we can defend that space when we do a prescribed fire. It would be much safer and allow us to keep what we call the fire in the box. So we're doing this kind of mechanical treatment before we go out and do any burns on sites like this. This is a photo of us burning our first burn at Wells Barren. That's what a burn looks like. And then we're also doing some monitoring to make sure that the work that we're doing will actually benefit the species that we're hoping to protect. And so every year at Wells Barren, I go out and do bird monitoring on doing spot counts, point counts. This is a result of our 2020 work, and basically shows a map of every bird that I heard or saw during the 3 days that I was out there. And my next step is to map the territories and figure out how many nesting pairs there are on this site. The other thing we're thinking about is what's going to happen with fire in relation to climate change, because it's something that we're going to have to deal with at some point. We know that the climate is changing. We know there's with the higher temperatures, it's likely we're going to have a longer fire season because there's going to be lack of snow cover. So the vegetation is going to be more prone to burn more frequently because of that lack of snow cover. We also know the past 4 summers have been incredibly dry. This last summer was ridiculously dry. And so we know there's going to be more summer drought, which will make for, again, longer fire seasons. One of the things that they're predicting is higher precipitation, but that precipitation is going to come in really large storms. We have one coming on Christmas Day. I think we're supposed to get like an inch of rain and 50-mile-per-hour winds. And when you have large precipitation events like that, it's much harder for the rain to soak into the ground. You have surface runoff into the ponds and streams. And because of that, the vegetation can't take advantage of the rainfall as much. The soils don't get the moisture soaked into the ground. And so oftentimes, even though you get a lot of precipitation, that doesn't always help the fire situation. And with these, it's been very windy this past year too. And the increased tree fall leads to higher fuel loads on the ground that could be a fire danger in some instances. We know that there's going to be changes in species composition. What we don't know is whether it's going to push our vegetation towards a more fire-prone condition or a less fire-prone condition, depending on what the species composition is. And so that's something that we have to keep an eye on moving forward. And then the 2 other things that we look at is invasive species and pests and pathogens. So invasive species could, again, because of that change in species composition, push a system to be either more fire prone or less fire prone, depending on the species that come in. With pests and pathogens, right now we're looking at things like emerald ash borer, which is having an impact on all of our ash trees in Maine, and hemlock woolly adelgid, which, from a fire perspective, large numbers of dead hemlock trees could be pretty flammable in some of our systems. So those are other things that we're looking for with regards to the future fire condition. It's interesting, if you look in up in northern Maine, we had some research done at Big Reed Forest Reserve, and one of the things that they found in looking at the fire history there was that the return interval was something like 8,000 years. It's a very long fire return interval. There's very little sign of history of fire in that part of the state. You go to other parts of the state and it's much more fire prone. And so keeping an eye on how that changes over time would be important with climate change. And so I just want to leave you with a few pictures of our crews out doing prescribed fire at our pine barrens and grassland sites. And thanks for your time.
Thank you, Nancy. If the presenters could turn their cameras back on for the question section. And I just want to note that the sandplain grassland that Nancy was talking about in Kennebuck and Wells, we have a little bit of that in Brunswick. There's a little bit of that on the BTLT property that Aliesha is working with them on to continue the burning there.
And just for people to get a picture of what a sandplain grassland looks like, almost the entire airport is sandplain grassland.
Oh.
Brunswick Airport. So.
So a couple of questions. One was, let's see. The campfire in California demonstrated that the fires took directions that had not been seen before. I understand the importance of training, but how can firefighters adapt to undetermined changes? It looks like that's a question for you, Aliesha.
I would say that more so in the last 5-10 years, there's been a change in tactic of creating a bigger box for that firefighting to happen, and giving room for fire to do things that you may not think are going to happen. And so, like, even with that little picture, that diagram of the prescribed burn that we showed, that's a box that's given a parameter. It's given a perimeter to keep that fire in, and they'll do it out west in hundreds of miles or thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres, creating a box that gives space to create these larger, 6 tractor lengths of a fire break instead of trying to bring people right to the fire line. So that's a shift in tactics, I think, that would answer that. And the other thing is, fire's unpredictable at times, and especially when you're talking about communities and houses in these towns and communities that are burned, it's going to create a different effect. So that's pretty much all I can say on that.
Another question, how this could go, I think, to either Aliesha or Nancy. How do you keep the trees from burning? And I assume that's in regards to prescribed burns. And I guess that would apply to a situation where you're doing a prescribed burn on an area that has trees, has standing trees.
So, one of the things that you can do is you can fine tune the rate that you're actually putting fire on the ground, so that if there are trees that you don't want to burn, you can sort of burn underneath those trees, taking your time to not get a lot of flame up under the tree that will then go up into the tops. Hardwoods, you don't really have to worry about too much. It's more in the softwoods. The other thing too is if there are areas that we don't want to see flames get up in the top of the trees, we may mow underneath those trees to knock that vegetation down before we do a prescribed fire.
Yeah, actually, I have a really nice picture from the prescribed burn on BTLT's property in 2010 that has a pine tree, and there's like a 4 or 5 foot diameter circle right around the base that's unburned. And it was a great example of how much control they had.
And the other thing I'll add to that too is that, at least with some of our pine barren sites, if we have 1 or 2 trees that do burn, we don't worry about it too much. It's actually part of our management strategy.
And I think if your folks wanted to see this, the Crystal Springs Farm, they've done some of that management right now where they've limbed some of those branches and mowed underneath the blueberry piece that they want to burn next spring. So they're out.
Okay, so for people who aren't familiar, if you go to Crystal Spring Farm and hike the East Trail to the Blueberry Loop, that's the open section along the Blueberry Loop is the section that Aliesha is talking about. Is BTLT using prescribed burning on its properties, especially where there are declining fire-dependent species? Is there a minimum area that can be burned and a minimum distance from residential areas? So a couple of questions in there. So I think the first question is, or are there fewer fire-dependent species on at least the properties that BTLT owns, or maybe in our area generally?
So, with regards to fire adapted species, what I've seen for most sites that are, blueberry sort of plains kind of thing, those sites typically are dominated by species that like to be burned. So they're probably mostly fire adapted. If you look at a lot of the sort of the matrix forest around here, the basic forest, a lot of that is oak pine forest. That probably has some fire history. Oaks can be burned perfectly happily, but what you don't have, we have a large component of white pine in those sites. White pine does not survive fire very well when it's young, because it's got very thin bark when it's young, and it doesn't resprout like pitch pine does. So running a fire like through a oak pine forest, you'll lose some of your pines to the and the oaks will survive just fine.
And the other part of that question, I think, Aliesha, for you, is there a minimum area that can be burned, I guess, size-wise, and a minimum distance from residential areas?
I don't think there's any town ordinance that gives that as an answer, but when there's a park on the outside of the burn unit, and we gave quite a bit of a buffer and a big control line right through there to give us space in case there was anything that we needed to deal with between the burn and the structures there. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does.
Okay.
Another question, understanding that prescribed burning was likely an important cultural practice for Maine's indigenous people, is there potential for collaborations on prescribed burns with native tribes here? I don't know, James, do you want to address that?
I don't know what we would collaborate on. I think that what people in Maine, as everybody so articulately presented tonight, is already happening. I mean, again, fire is something that is part of human history. It's not necessarily something that is just common to indigenous people. It has evolved through time as society has evolved through time. So there's really nothing that we could share with them that they're not already doing.
Are you doing any burning on your land?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
You know, one of the reasons why I even wrote this paper was it was part of a forest management plan. The tribe wanted to know how much we were burning culturally and historically. So that fire management plan was probably 15 years ago. And I don't know of any fires that we've done on our lands in that time.
Okay. Another question, what pollinates blazing star? Nancy, I think that's you.
Yeah, it's pollinated, you know, butterflies, bees. So a lot of different insects will come to blazing star.
And someone wanted to know sort of how or if fire is used as a management tool for controlling invasives.
Yeah, you know, in some places it is. One of the things, you know, using Waterboro and Kennebunk Plains as examples, we're using it more to ensure that invasives don't become established rather than to control invasives, because we don't have an invasive problem there. We're pretty lucky. I know other people have been using invasive fire for some invasives with varying degrees of success. I know a lot of people will burn Phragmites, but I'm not sure it does much, except makes for a really interesting burn. I don't know, Alicia, you've probably been involved in those a little more often than I have.
I actually, so I was working with the cooperative extension for the University of Maine. We had some bed straw, and they had tried some burning in the fall or in the spring prior to, without a lot of thatch to give it that heat that it needs to carry. So we were actually going to have them come down and do some observations before and after on this piece in Augusta, but the burn didn't happen because we had a lot of red flag warnings during that time. But I think, like you said, it's hit or miss on some of this. And I think it's how the fuels are treated prior to and finding their growth cycles and where they're going to be hit the hardest. So I think it's a work in progress around here.
Well, I'm very curious about to know if it is effective on smooth bed straw, because there's quite a bit of that around, and it seems to be spreading. A question, could prescribed burn be used to benefit the pitch pine stand on the Brunswick Town Commons? I don't know if, Nancy, are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I think one of the, you know, one of the things about the pitch pine stand at a town commons is, and I probably haven't been out there in like 15 years, is that the trees are on the older side, and pitch pine actually has, you know, once it gets up to about 70 or so years old, it doesn't survive fire as well. Maybe the one role that fire could play there is to treat the surface in a way to benefit the regeneration of the germination regeneration of pitch pine out there. but I'm not familiar enough with that site to know. And it'd be the other thing is it'd be kind of an interesting place to burn because of the sort of the neighborhoods in behind there.
Mhm. What kinds of tools are used to create the back and side breaks? Just shovels, or are there mechanized ways of clearing brush down to plain soil?
You can use a bulldozer. A lot of times you'll see giant pieces of machinery out west, and we've used them here in state. There's a piece at Bradbury Mountain that they used. There's a backfield. I can't remember the name of it, but it's not right at the mountain site. It's further down, but it's a piece also owned by the state park. And they used a dozer there to create the breaks. So you can use anything as long as it's going to scarify the ground and get to the dirt. Tractor plows that'll take and row right through, and then you can clean that up afterwards. But yeah, you can use anything.
Okay. A certain well-known individual who is a climate change denier has falsely claimed that forest management is responsible for all the fires in the West. But does the fact that we have more fires than anything whatsoever to do with not doing enough of these prescribed burns to take care of all the undergrowth and presumably fuel on the ground? So I think the question is that should we be doing more prescribed burns, presumably in the forest, to reduce the fuel load in forested areas? I think that's the question.
You want that one, Alicia? You want me to start? I'll start. One of the things that, I think that there, especially out west, there could be a huge benefit to doing more prescribed fire as a management tool. The one thing I think that we run into is that, especially on federal land, I think it takes a lot to get to the point where you can implement a program because the politics become involved. The other thing is that, we now have humans living in places that are very fire prone, and it makes it harder and harder to actually do prescribed fire because you have to think about the human communities in and around those fire areas. So I think it's actually a combination of sort of mechanical treatments for out west, I'm talking, but a combination of mechanical treatments and prescribed fire that I think is going to help that fire situation out west.
And Nancy, just a clarification, you referred to the return interval on, at least at Big Reed. And for folks that might not know, that's referring to how often, the frequency with which that forest would burn under natural conditions where there's no human involvement or creation.
So basically for a site like that, there's been one fire since glaciation.
Wow, that's amazing. So not a lot of naturally caused fire at least in our, is that true for Southern Maine? It's less true for Southern Maine, I assume.
Yeah, and it also depends on the forest type and whether or not, for instance, there was indigenous burning and whether or not there was agricultural burning, the whole history of how fire was used. The other thing, if you look at Southern Maine railroads, you have the railroads coming through. That was a huge source of igniting fires back, especially when there were steam engines. And so, in Southern Maine, I think it's a much different picture. You have more fire-prone habitats. You have less snow cover, all those kinds of things that would contribute to more of a fire picture in Southern Maine.
Mm-hmm. And this is the last question, I think, a reference to the amount of sort of science and training involved in prescribed burning and asking, and I think this has sort of been answered, asking whether the tribes and land trusts and scientists and presumably fire departments and the Forest Service work together as partners. And I know that at least locally, there have been a lot of partnerships. I know the Brunswick Fire Department did the first prescribed burning on BTLT's property as a training exercise. And it does seem, I assume there's a certain amount of people who are trained in wildfires, but who are sometimes used on prescribed burns because they have the training.
So absolutely, that's like I had kind of mentioned in the presentation, being able to watch fire as it moves through in a controlled manner will still give you a good perspective on fire. So we have a lot of our firefighters that are wildland trained that come to prescribed burns just to get that extra bit of information and have those mental slides that they can go to when they're fighting the fire. The other part is the Maine Prescribed Burn Council. I think this kind of fits in. The goal is to get folks in the community to understand how they can burn, what they need to burn, and give the tools out there. We're in its infancy still, especially COVID really dropped back some of our work. But even just, I spoke with John Bailey, who's the chair, works with Nancy. He got a phone call from somebody in a master's program at the university who's a Penobscot, and she was reaching out about burning the islands on the Penobscot River and kind of what can we do? How can we work together? So hopefully in the coming years, we can really hash that out with the Prescribed Burn Council and give people good information so that they can do it themselves or find the people that can help.
And the other thing too that, so we do run a 130-190 training for people who want to get their foot in the door with doing prescribed fire. And we run a field course. COVID shut that down this year. But the other thing that, a couple other things. One of the other things that we were in the process of organizing is something called these training exchanges, fire training exchanges, where we had gotten some funding through the Northeast Fire Compact and some other sources to bring a bunch of fire practitioners together and do like a 2-week intensive of doing prescribed fires across a small section of southern Maine and New Hampshire. We had to cancel it because of COVID, but we do intend to try to do that in the next couple of years when everything is right. The other thing on prescribed fires, when you get trained for a position on a fire crew, you have to go through, well, we use the federal training modules, and basically you work on what are called task books for different fire positions. And if you're a wildland firefighter, you can actually go to a prescribed fire and get some of your task books signed off on to work towards getting certified for other fire positions. And so there's a lot of ability for us to collaborate to get more people trained to do fire, whether it's wildfire or prescribed fire.
So if a private landowner wanted to do a burn on, say, a hayfield, who would they use to do it for them? I mean, who would they get to do it for them?
You can have Aliesha.
Yeah, well, as of right now, a private citizen, it is more difficult. You'd need a permit, and you'd need to be able to prove when you're getting that permit what you have for resources. And currently, fire departments aren't jumping at the bit to do that because it's liability. Mm-hmm. So it's private area. So not only are we talking about the piece that needs to be burned that's owned by one person, we're talking about all the land around it that's owned by other people. And so there's quite a bit of liability that comes with a prescribed burn. So that's the answer.
And the other thing is that, so for instance, us as an organization, we carry extra insurance just because we're doing prescribed fire. So, and we have, you know, when we're doing fire on other people's property, so we burn for the Maine Army National Guard, we burn on some state land. We have to, I mean, the thing that we always have to talk about is who's liable for what. And that's also the purpose of the burn plan. When you do a burn plan for a burn unit, and you have all those fire parameters, what the weather has to be, how many crew you're going to have, what are your contingencies, that's almost like a legal document. So if something goes wrong and you, for instance, decide you're going to keep burning when you're out, when the wind is blowing too hard, and something bad happens, that's not a good situation. And so you have that burn plan as a sidebar, basically, that tells you, yeah, you can burn, or no, you better not go out there. And so a private landowner doesn't have that kind of thing.
Yeah. So last question, and then we'll let people go. What about more northern parts of Maine? Any prescribed burning you can speak about in northern Maine?
The only site that I know of, and James and Alicia might know of others, we're actually looking at potentially doing some prescribed fire on one of our preserves in Crystal, which is what's closest. I'm trying to think of what's closest. Crystal, like 30 minutes north of Millinocket. And it's a site that has a federally endangered plant on it. The only population of this plant outside of the upper Midwest. And in the upper Midwest, it's found on prairie fens, they're basically wet fens that they use prescribed fire on. And so we're looking to potentially do small burns on that site where that plant is located. Other than that, that's the only one we're looking at right now.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks so much to our presenters, Alicia and James and Nancy, for joining us. And I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but there are probably a few of us who could talk about fire all day long because it's really interesting. But I hope this brought a little light into everybody's short, dark day. And our January program is going to be about bird decline. And some of the things you can do to help the bird population. So that will be on the fourth Tuesday, also via Zoom. So thanks again to our presenters. It was great to hear from you. And
thanks for the invitation.
yeah, so have a great evening, everyone.